I'm going to move on to the NICE and HTA reform. We've kind of landed in a good place for that. So I want to take a few moments to focus on potential and ideal changes to the NICE guidelines and the HTA review process. Kylie, what are some of those proposed changes to NICE's HTA framework and how might they impact the rare disease evaluations? Can you share any of that?
Yeah, actually, Sheila might be more of an expert in this space, but to date, I think there's nothing concrete in terms of HTA reform. So I think that's a really important part, which we have sort of no commitment, I don't believe, from government to formally propose any changes from the HTA framework. And I think, as Sheila said earlier, everything, whenever there's any kind of proposal or discussion around changing the HTA framework, NICE very much come back to anything needs to be cost neutral. So unless there is a shift from government around that mentality of cost neutrality, change to the HTA framework are probably going to be quite limited. And I think the severity modifier is a great example of that. It is underutilized. We know that. So how do we make sure that that is being used correctly is one key component. One of the things that is speculated at the moment, and there is growing calls from key ministers, the Science, Innovation and Technology Committee just last week, is around increasing the quality thresholds, and that has been, the merit of that has been discussed for some time. And, that NICE obviously uses these quality thresholds to estimate the health benefits of new medicines. And I very much agree that, they are outdated. They've been in place since 2004, and we should be looking to increase those. But for this discussion, I think it's really important to be clear that that will not solve the problem for rare diseases. And these are complex medicines. We've, spoken about high risk of failure makes them more expensive to develop than for larger populations like rare diseases, like diabetes and heart disease and other larger populations. So they really should, and the complexity of smaller data sets, etc., they really shouldn't be evaluated in the same way. And we have this huge gap between HST and STA that we need to solve for. And even within HST, or the highly specialized technology, which is reserved for ultra rare conditions, Sheila outlined there that even that is not solving or set up for success necessarily for all of those that fit that HST criteria as well. So, as the rare disease industry group, we're calling for a separate evaluation pathway for some rare diseases that we feel are not appropriate for a cost effectiveness assessment, and that one that assesses budget impact and uses broader criteria. So we'd like to see very much some change in the thinking, as I said earlier, and flexibility rather than this very stringent kind of mechanisms around the current HTA methods. But when it comes to thinking about this and sort of the cost piece, my view is, and this is very much a personal view, is that as a country, and UK is not alone, but I see this very much in the UK, there is a real fear that access reform will cost too much, and that paralyzes the country, and then we do nothing at all. And so you see nothing. And I think this is very true in rare diseases, and some conversations that I have had where people think because you have so many of these individual rare diseases and the individual treatments are expensive, that all of a sudden that's going to sort of blow out of proportion. And I would love to think that we had a medicine for every rare disease tomorrow, but we don't. There is a long way to go before we're there, but we do have medicines today that patients aren't able to access. So if we're paralyzed by this fear, we really won't be able to progress the access agenda. So I think it's really important for all stakeholders to really contextualize what changes need to be made for what is a relatively small number of medicines that in actual fact will have a low budget impact. So I think ensuring that we can make appraisals more proportionate and responsive to the realities of the rare disease sort of population and community will get us a long way. And I hope that we can very much have those conversations in order to progress rather than trying to fit everything into the boxes that already exist with some slight tweaking around the edges, because that won't solve for the challenge that we have for rare disease access.
Sheila, do you want to kind of add into that?
Sure. I mean, I think Kylie summed it up really nicely. Tinkering around the edges isn't going to work. I do feel like that we need to kind of reflect on what do we want. Nico made a great observation around let's start with the outcomes and let's think about how we can adapt and fit the processes and methods and approaches around that. I think for me, there are some strengths, but they feel I feel like they're not as strong as they ought to be. So you could argue that the transparency in the process and the methods, both those that are deployed by NICE and NHS England to a degree, is a good thing, right? A lot of countries around the world don't have these transparent processes. Everybody goes into a black box and an answer comes out at the end. So I think that's really good. And then there's the ability in scenarios to secure commercial flexibilities, which again can be useful. However, the limitations that we actually now work with, as Kylie's identified, is the severity modifier. It's supposed to be a great thing, supposed to serve rare disease communities, but actually with this cost neutrality kind of umbrella over it, it's really not serving the populations that it was designed to support. The kind of high prices that we have to contend with now, and I don't blame my UK kind of pharma team members for these, but of course they're having to align with what's going on from a global context and trying to fit around that. It's really difficult for the system to reconcile those in a lot of cases, and it goes back to that population health. People think if I can buy more for my pound, then why am I not spending it there? But of course, it goes, then we need to think about actually what are the societal benefits that are being delivered if we are going to give access to these medicines. And I kind of think about the oncology. Why is oncology in cancer so successful? It's emotive, it's had a lot of political kind of will to change. And I feel like we need to have a similar sort of movement for rare, in that how can we kind of I was at a conference last week, somebody talked about making rare cool, because it's clearly not cool enough. It's not like oncology, and it's not emotive in the way that cancer seems to be. So I think there's a bit of that. And then finally, I think one of the limitations is that we are always starting from a really poor foundation. So can we do some more work collectively, like the stuff that Charlotte's mentioned, to come together to build a strong foundation with all of the stakeholders, so that actually when we go into a conversation, we're not just thinking about the therapy that needs to get through, we're thinking about the pathway, how services will be delivered, who will be delivering them, and link that up with the NHS 10-year plan. Because if we can find linkages with some of the kind of policies that are already in play, we're more likely to get traction with the government and some of the people that are making these big decisions.
Yeah. And I think maybe that comes back to that national clinical director, doesn't it? Somebody that can be really passionate and steer it from that point of view. Charlotte, how do you feel NICE is able to be responsive to patient need in general? Where do you see barriers for patient groups as well when they're working within these review meetings?
Sure. So NICE has a really difficult job, right? I think we all accept that the NHS has only a certain amount of money and they have a very difficult job to do. But I think for us, especially, patients still need to be front and center with every appraisal. The cost should not be the first thing that we're thinking about. It's the impact that this could have on patients, the impact it could have on society, and the impact it could have on the economy. There are definitely some positive examples of engagement, but it can feel a lot of the time that patient input rarely affects the economic modelling, and especially when there's a lack of quantitative data to back that up. Even, we can have patient experts talking till they're blue in the face about the impacts of their treatment, of their condition, and oftentimes that doesn't really make a detrimental impact actually on the outcome, which can make it really hard for patients then to want to engage within the process as well, because they're not feeling like they're being listened to. We've seen times in appraisals where there's been several committee meetings and a patient expert is saying their same story over and over again, and committee members are kind of being like, oh, that's really powerful and emotional, but is just repeating that every time actually having an impact here, and how is it more that patients can really showcase what they're saying? there are massive areas within the NICE process that I think need to change to help make sure that they can be more responsive to patients. So the process can be so long. We've seen occasions where we're on fourth committee meetings. This is 2, 3 years of the process happening, and people struggling to get access. Yes, the news of speeding up between MHRA and NICE is really encouraging, but how's that going to work in practice? And how's that going to work for these rare conditions where uncertainty is so high that it leads to long conversations to actually get to a decision point?
Yeah.
Quality of life is a big thing as well, and I've mentioned this about caregivers too, like being able to, there's no clear guidelines of how we incorporate quality of life for caregivers within health technology appraisals. NICE needs to do better in being able to incorporate that so that we can make sure that it's fully included properly, especially a big thing for rare disease. This is something we see across every appraisal that we're involved in, and it's so important to incorporate that as well. And then I go back to my thing with data. It's the same old thing. NICE needs to be more pragmatic and more flexible, and we've spoken about this before, but there is so much data that is missing, and like someone said, we're probably not going to get that data for some of these. So how is it that NICE can be more pragmatic about that and understand that they're not going to get that data? Use patient and clinical experts more. They're there for a reason. Use what they're saying and the experiences that they have and their expertise to help us find the best assumptions to use to take forward and use for cost effectiveness calculations.
Yeah.